All right, everybody, welcome to the Gilder Spotlight podcast. Today we have a very interesting and exciting guest. His name is John Graham. He has quite an interesting background from getting his undergraduate at Harvard University to getting his master's at Stanford University. He had quite a career as a diplomat. But John, could you give our listeners a quick introduction to yourself?
Wow, that's hard to do. My bumper sticker is that at age 82, I'm lucky to be alive. My whole first part of my life was one crazy ass adventure after the other. I was addicted to adrenaline rushes, so I climbed big, dangerous mountains for a lot of years. I was a diplomat, but not in fancy embassies in Europe wearing a suit and tie. Mostly I was in jungles and deserts working with and in the middle of revolutions and wars, getting shot at by the Viet Cong or tracked by the KGB. So yeah, I by the time I was 40 years old, I dodged a violent death at least a dozen times. And so I got stories on all of those, but I don't want to use up all of our time. Most of them are in a memoir called Quest, Quest, which your readers can get. And yeah, I'll stop there because I can go on and on. I had a very adventuresome life, and it turned around after a battle in Vietnam, and I finally understood that simply being very selfish about my life, about seeing nothing but adventure as the sole reason for my being, and not really giving a damn about other people or other people's causes or other people's needs. It was the lowest point of my life, but when I realized how shallow my life had become, that's all I cared about was my own needs for an
Still there,
adrenaline
John?
rush and another great adventure. And since I'd never been killed, I figured I was indestructible, so I kept heading from one dangerous adventure to the next. But like I say, in the Battle of Vietnam, I finally began to understand that I had to stop. I had a heart, and yet up until that point in my life, I was then about 30, that life had been totally self about my own needs, and so I began to turn it around. It took a while, but I began to orient myself toward a life of service. I ended up with the United Nations, for example, where I fought hard for peace and justice issues for the so-called third world, the global south. I'm very proud to say I had a hand in the ending of apartheid, racial inequality and oppression in South Africa. And then after that, I joined the Giraffe Heroes Project, which is now after 42 years, it's a huge global force in getting people to get out and solve the public problems that are important to them, whether that be corruption or poor leadership or crimes against women or environmental pollution or whatever. And we've done a terrific job in the last 42 years of finding people who are making a difference on problems like that and telling their stories and getting other people to do the same thing. So we're storytellers, and it works. And then
I love that.
finally, I've always had a good gift of gab. So there's 5 books out there I've done and zillions of podcasts and interviews and stuff, all on the theme of helping people find the meaning of their life, not through adventure, not through money, not through power, but through service, helping make the world a better place. That's a bumper
I
sticker, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah, that is. Well, John, I appreciate that introduction, and I think you have such a unique and interesting life and career, and I kind of want to start at the beginning, not the beginning, but I guess you went to Harvard. Looks like you graduated in geology. Why did you decide to study geology?
Well, I'd always been an outdoors person, and I'd always been a science nerd as a kid. You know, I had the home chemistry set in the basement, advanced placement at Harvard in chemistry and math. I mean, I headed for Harvard to be a scientist, right? And it turned to geology because I'd always been an outdoors person. So I said, hey, how can I be a scientist and an outdoors person at the same time? So geology was the obvious reason to do that. But by the time I was halfway through Harvard, I realized I didn't want to be a scientist at all. I was much more interested in what people did than what rocks did. But
Mhm.
in any case, that's why it was geology.
Wow. And then you started your career as a foreign service officer. Tell me a little bit about that. I'd love to learn a little bit more because you were from 1965 to 1980, you're a foreign service officer. You're in a bunch of different countries. I know that you were also a vet in Vietnam. How did you get, what got you into becoming a foreign service officer?
Good question. Well, there I was. After college, I was hitchhiking around the world, taking it a year and hitchhiking around the world, trying to figure out my life. And I had a choice. I could have stayed a scientist, a geologist. I had a degree. I could have also gone into writing because on my trip around the world hitchhiking, I sold a number of stories to big time newspapers like the Boston Globe, and they were ready to offer me a job as a young foreign correspondent. So that was a possible career. But then I'd also taken the exams for the Foreign Service before I left on this long trip. So I was juggling all three of these. I pretty much had ruled out science. So it really came down to, did I want to be a foreign correspondent or a diplomat? And I had a choice, and I decided that I wanted the diplomated part for a variety of reasons, all of which I explained in that memoir, because I wanted to be where the power was. I wanted to shape events, and I thought diplomats did that. And if I played my cards right, I could do all that. I could make a difference in the kind of policies that help shape people's lives, as diplomats did, I thought at the time. And at the same time, if I played my cards right, I could also have some great adventures, because after all, diplomats were, some of them are in pretty difficult places in the world and doing difficult, adventurous things. So that's what led me to settle on accepting the offer from the Foreign Service. The first 2 years of my diplomatic career didn't seem to serve that purpose at all. I was in a very small country, Liberia in West Africa, where nothing significant happened, and I was sort of stuck there for
This
two
was
years. But after that,
1965.
things got very interesting. I went to Libya, where I happened to be right in the middle of the revolution when Gaddafi came to power. So I had a very important job dealing with some of these young revolutionaries. And my diplomatic life got really very interesting. And I began to see that I could play a real exciting role. I could make a difference in the world, and I could have great adventures because, after all, a revolution, cars burning in the streets, angry mobs. This was just great. I loved it. I mean, I'd always had a love for adventure, and I kept walking away from all the danger in one piece. So, yeah, a revolution in Libya really got me thinking, yes, my career as a diplomat is going to be a real adventure. And it was. It was. Because from there, I went to Vietnam. I told the State Department I wanted to go to the most difficult and dangerous place they had. And so they agreed with that. And I ended up as the advisor to the mayor of Hue, which was a city only 50 miles south of the demarcation line, the DMZ, that then separated North Vietnam from the south. So it was a very dangerous place to be. And I had a lot of adventures in Vietnam, including being in the middle of the so-called Easter Offensive in 1972, where Hue was virtually surrounded by the North Vietnamese. And at that point, my life was saved only by American carrier jets that finally beat back the North Vietnamese army just 6 miles away from the city walls. But in any case, it was during that Easter Offensive, during that battle, that I realized that I wasn't in Vietnam as a patriot. Not only that, I thought the war was wrong. I thought it was absolutely evil what we were doing over there. I also knew that we had no chance of winning, and yet I was in the middle of a shooting war. I mean, I wasn't a junior officer anymore. People were dying because of decisions I was making, and it suddenly caught up with me that what the hell am I doing with my life? This is not what I want to do. I don't want to be remembered just as a killer, as someone who was part of a very wrong war. And so I got out of the situation in Vietnam, luckily, in one piece. I went to Stanford, but that was more or less because the State Department was rewarding me for not getting killed in Vietnam, and also because I had what is now called a sizable case of PTSD. I mean, I would walk on the shadow sides of the street in Palo Alto, California, to avoid sniper fire. I mean, I was pretty messed up. In addition to being messed up with that revelation in Vietnam that my life needed to change big time. I needed to get away from physical adventure into something that had more meaning for me, which no longer was physical adventure. It was trying to do something to make the world a better place, to sort of fight the kind of things that I used to be fighting for, and to try to make a difference on questions of peace and equity, poverty and injustice that I saw so clearly in the third world. And that was the turnaround. And it took, like I say, it took a while. So much of my life was embedded in adventure and physical adventure. I didn't turn on a dime.
Do you just curious, John, kind of your story reminds me of one of our great presidents, Teddy Roosevelt.
Yeah, go
Did
ahead.
Teddy Roosevelt uh, did Teddy Roosevelt kind of he was an adrenaline junkie and then found kind of later in life his purpose was to help with the national parks to bring more meaning to that. How does Teddy Roosevelt, someone like that, did he kind of influence your upbringing as far as like a role model that you looked up to?
He was one. Yes, no, I read a lot about Teddy Roosevelt, and I agree with you about the pattern of his life. And yeah, I suppose I never got to be president, but yeah,
Correct.
as a young man, he had one adventure after the other and walked away from them all. And then we got into politics, like I got into diplomacy. So I
Hmm.
suppose, yes, there are others,
So,
but it was hard to find role models because my early role models were all like He-Man, John Wayne type people. And they were the
oh,
people I thought I should be like. And I didn't realize how shallow that was until that climactic time in Vietnam, which turned my life around.
and so you went to Stanford, and I did read too, kind of in your biography, that kind of Stanford was a time in your life to recover from PTSD, and kind of all of the things that happened in the Vietnam War. And so, how long did you stay in Stanford, and how did kind of and it looked like you got a master's, or yeah, you ended up getting a system analysis degree. So why did you decide to get a system analysis degree at Stanford? And
I could have got it in anything. It's just that I was, like I say, I was a science swamp, and systems analysis. I got to play around with the new computers, which were just coming on then in the early '70s. But the degree was the smallest part of being at Stanford. It really was. It was a minor part of my being there. My major part was to get my life together. And a lot of that was not just PTSD, it was the other challenge in my life about transforming my whole personality into a caring, responsible human being from a warmonger. And that took a lot of work. And a lot of it happened in what were then called encounter groups in California, discussion groups. You got together with other people and you talked about your lives as honestly as you could, and it was a support group. Not Alcoholics Anonymous, but it was a support group in which you get to talk about your lives. And at first, I went into these groups and I thought, oh, I'm a big shot. I've had all these adventures. Everybody else in this group is a wimp. Hell, they've never had they've never climbed a big dangerous mountain. They've never faced Viet Cong bullets. I'm the big guy here. And then about almost on the last day of one of these encounter groups, the leader of the group, and this particular group was all men, and we spent the whole week learning about the theory of, I would say it's now a fact, that every one of us has both a male and a female part, and that there was a female part of me. There was a part of me that was compassionate, that that operated on those levels, that had a heart, and I had like nailed a huge sheet of plywood over that heart for 30 years because I wanted to be John Wayne, and John Wayne didn't express any emotions. He was not a compassionate character. So the board stayed there. And so at one of these encounter groups, the leader says to about a room of about 15 men, who do you think has the most feminine characteristics of all of us? Who do you think is the most feminine man in the room? And he didn't mean that as a Negative. He meant that as a positive. Which man do you think really has the potential to be a really compassionate human being? And without any exception, they all pointed to me, and I just choked. I said, "Are you kidding? I'm John Wayne, goddammit. I'm not a compassionate wimp like maybe all of you are." And I stormed out of that room and I ran down the trail. It was out in the wood. This was an encounter group out in the mountains. And finally, after about 20 minutes of running, I realized these men were right. And I just sat down on the trail and began to weep. I began to see, Jesus, these guys are right. And I began to think of all the things in my life where I wanted to be compassionate and didn't. I mean, I had a doll when I was a little kid, and my mother, who was a Croatian, a tough Croatian lady, took it away from me at a certain point, like age 4 or 5, because boys don't play with dolls past that age. But I took the doll back because I wanted that doll, and I loved that doll. His name was Sammy. And the other things happened too. I realized I did have a compassionate spirit, and I had ignored it. I had suppressed it in order to become John Wayne. And that was the problem. And I had to get that, I had to rip that layer of plywood off my heart, and I had to begin exercising who I really was, which was a responsible, compassionate human being capable of helping other people, of being of service, of helping solve public problems. And so that encounter group, if anything, was by far the most important thing that happened to me at Stanford. Getting the degree was inconsequential. I never used it.
And what do you think when that encounter group, they all pointed at you, what was like the characteristic or feature that you had that made everybody want to point to you?
Yes, I mean, it was totally hidden from me, but not from them. That was the point. It was so, those boards were so tightly hammered over my heart, I could not see it. That's why I screamed curses at them and ran out of the room, because in that first instant, I thought they were totally wrong. I really thought I was John Wayne. And then I began to realize that no, 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 that was just the part of me that was making up for being bullied as a kid or whatever. And so, I needed to find the other part of me, and that was the realization. And it took a long time, but I gradually fought my way through that, and sort of at the halfway point in my life. I mean, now I was like, what was I? Late 30s. No, it wasn't late 30s, early 30s.
Early 30s.
Early 30s. Yeah, and then I had the chance to go to the United Nations where I could really do some good, and my life changed. My life changed dramatically. When I finally discovered that the real meaning in life doesn't come from adventure and doesn't come from money or power. It comes from service. One kind of service or the other. It's different for each one of us.
I 100% agree that with that. And then just as far as kind of what were kind of like or how long did it take you to kind of, switch your mindset to be more compassionate? I know that you had to ply off that piece of wood in order to feel that compassionate, but or maybe what were some of the practices that you did to start putting
Yeah.
yourself into that of a compassionate person?
Well, it was 3 steps up and two back, because the first thing that I did wasn't so much practices, it was just looking around. The first thing I did was to spend more time with my own children. I had 2 little kids at the time, and playing, being a little league coach back in Washington, D.C., and playing with my kids, and being a father was an important part. My first marriage was then irretrievably on the rocks, so that really wasn't part of it. But I mostly, in the Foreign Service, had a chance to make a difference. And like I say, it was 3 steps up and two back, because one of my major jobs when I got back to Washington, D.C. after Stanford was working in the State Department's Military Bureau, where I dealt with military subjects, more wars and revolutions, only this time from behind a desk in Washington. I even worked for NATO planning nuclear war. So you can see I was still doing a lot of tough guy things at the same time that I was struggling to find a softer, more generous, more compassionate self. So it was, it was
I
I was
definitely think,
wrestling. I was
yeah.
because at the same time I was the State Department's fair-haired boy because I was so tough and smart. They kept promoting me, so I was rapidly becoming one of the youngest senior officers in the entire Foreign Service. And that all went to my head, and in a way drew me back from that path that began with comeuppance in Vietnam. So it took a while, and helping end apartheid really made me realize that I really could make a difference. And not only that, but it was a hell of an adventure because for the stuff I was doing at the United Nations, I did most of it conflicting, no, disobeying the orders from my own government because the US government doesn't want to be that compassionate. It doesn't want to, in a lot of cases, it doesn't want to work for peace and justice and the global south and a lot of other considerations, oil, for example, and selling guns and all kinds of nasty things that America was involved in. They wanted me to go slow at the United Nations and not raise waves, but that wasn't good enough for me. I raised a lot of waves, and I should have been fired a couple of times for the things I did. For example, I wasn't supposed to talk to the Palestinians, but I did. I wasn't supposed to have any dealings with Castro's Cubans, and I did. I wasn't
Wow.
supposed to make the South African racists mad, but I did. And so I did all these things, and I realized, hell, I can circumvent the powers that be and make a difference. I just have to have enough guts to do it. And I pressed ahead.
What gave you those guts to go against the grain with a lot of these folks?
Well, I did it because I really began to realize that there was nothing more powerful in my life or your life or any of our viewer or listeners' lives than meaning. Everybody wants to find meaning in their life. We all want to look in the mirror in the morning, and what looks back at us, we want to feel that we're on the earth for a purpose. We're not just taking up space. We all want to feel that way. And we all look for meaning in our own ways. For me, as a young man, that meaning was physical adventure. For a whole lot of people I know and you know, it's money and power. And I think that's a pretty fragile source of meaning myself. The only source of meaning that I've
It's all
found
human-made
and that I've seen,
constructs,
the
money
only
and
real
power.
source of meaning that makes any that sticks is service. And I learned that through the Giraffe Heroes Project, which is the nonprofit my wife and I have been running for these 42 years, because part of it is finding people who do have meaning in their lives through being of service, and then talking to them and telling their stories. And they all say basically the same thing. I'm doing what I'm doing because I need to help other people. I need to solve this problem. So we say, well, why do you have to solve this problem? And they say, well, because it produces meaning in my life. They all say the same thing, that the meaning in their life, which is so important, comes through some kind of service. And if you don't find that out, if you live and die thinking that the meaning in your life still comes from being a billionaire or a big shot, you're wrong. You're going to find that out sooner or later.
It's funny because like you see that trend in like I don't know, like an example is like Elizabeth Holmes. Like she always focused that she wanted to be a billionaire, and then you know, she had a lot of fraud and a lot of issues. And I think when you focus on, passion and purpose and service, money will come and respect and credibility will come. But if you focus on purpose first, and I think that's ultimately a way better way to live, and you actually create a bigger difference. So I
Yes,
really resonate with
yes,
that.
of course I agree. And I do a lot of, well, not so much since COVID, but I used to run around the world a lot, physically giving speeches. And now most of my output now is through books and podcasts and interviews like
Mhm.
this one. But I always say the same thing. I always come down to what's important to me is to coach other people, to try to convince other people to look around and look at the resources they have, the skills they have, and ask themselves when they look in that mirror in the morning, what should I be using these skills and resources to do anyway? Making a better sewing machine or making another $1 million on a stock trade, that doesn't seem to do it anymore. But working to solve a local problem to clean up a polluted lake in my town, or perhaps taking a real interest in helping solve some big international problem like climate change or any number of other problems, dealing with corruption in my own company or whatever. That's more important. That's where meaning comes from. And every time I get involved in something that has meaning, I feel better. So living a life with meaning isn't sackcloth and ashes. You were trying to say that. It isn't sackcloth and ashes. It's what brings real pleasure to people's lives. It makes life worth living. I mean, and you begin to realize that being of service, helping solve tough public problems, using the skills and resources that you've got to help solve those problems is not only an exciting adventure, which is great for me, but it's also an enormous benefit to our own personal happiness. Discover that. People discover that. So when I talk to people, I say, hey, I'm not talking about sackcloth and I'm not talking about sacrifice at all. I'm talking about
Hmm.
giving yourself a better, more profitable, more satisfactory life. You'll have more friends. Your relationships will be better. You'll feel better. You'll sleep better. You'll probably live longer. So, hell, you can look at this as a self-interested endeavor, service, that is.
And so I want to get to talking about the Giraffe Project. And you started it 40 years ago. What was the catalyst to start that?
Well, first of all, I have to correct you. I've been talking about the Giraffe Project, but I didn't start it. It was started by a remarkable woman named Ann Medlock, who was a writer and editor in New York City. And she realized that most of the news in those days, it was before social media, we're talking about 1980. 82. It was newspapers, and all those big stories were all about gloom and doom, fires and rapes and pillages and wars and stuff. She knew there were great people out in the world doing great things, inspiring things, and yet nobody told their stories. So she decided she would set up her own alternative news network to tell the stories of people doing good, and not only that, people doing good and taking risks to do good. So the name giraffe came out of that because giraffes have a long neck, and what Anne was doing was finding people who were sticking their necks out, making a difference anywhere in the world, and then getting their stories told. Where she could, she would interview these people, and then she would get a movie star or a stage star. After all, she lived in New York, to do the voiceover, and she began by creating 3 minute um, stories and putting them on vinyl disc. I bet half your listeners, or maybe three-quarters of them, don't even know what a vinyl disc is. It goes round and round on a turntable, right? You put a needle on it, sound comes out. Okay, well, that's what we had on the day before social media. So she began putting these stories on vinyl disc and sending them out to radio stations. At first, it was just small stations, but then it caught on, and people began to realize that the storytelling Anne was doing was really important. I met her about that time. I thought that what would change the world was my wonderful speeches, because I'd always had a good gift of gab. And I thought storytelling kind of maybe nice thing, but it was kind of lightweight. Boy, was I wrong. I didn't realize that, like for 10,000 years, storytelling has been an enormous, impactful influence on cultures and societies. I mean, I'm guessing that telling the stories of heroes was important to Neanderthals dancing around their campfire. And in the Middle Ages, you had the troubadours telling stories of heroes to get people to be heroic. And Anne discovered the same thing. She was the troubadour of our age. She knew that telling the stories of real heroes would get other people to be heroic too. And that was the whole reason for the Giraffe Project. And about that point, I fell in love with her, and everything she was doing became a lot more important. We got married, and we've been working together as romantic partners, but as business partners in the Giraffe Project now for 42 years. And we've been doing the same thing. We find people and tell their stories. Of course, now we do it with the latest in social media. And we have a vast program for schools, a curriculum that goes from kindergarten through high school. I run Giraffe Heroes International. We have 7 overseas affiliates, all doing the same thing, telling stories, moving people. And like I said, I do a lot of podcasts and interviews and write books and stuff and blogs, all on the same theme. And that's what we do. And it's been enormously successful. I mean, I can't count the number of letters and feedbacks and emails we get about the lives that we are changing and the problems we're helping solve. So the Giraffe Project has been a great vehicle for both Ann and myself in terms of bringing meaning to our lives and in helping others do the same thing.
Love it. Hey, John, do you mind if I quickly go to the restroom really quick? I haven't had a break from my last meeting, and I'll edit this part out
Yes,
too. Okay,
of
perfect, perfect.
course.
I'll be right back. I apologize. Awesome. Sorry about that.
Not at
So
all.
now I
We
want
can
to
do what we have to do.
now I want to jump into how has the draft project evolved with the presence of social media and getting, because now it's a lot easier to get, more stories out there. I guess back in the day, in like in the 80s, there's, a couple news stations. So how has the draft project evolved with this day and age?
Well, we're just smart. I mean, our aim has been the same. How do we get these stories of these giraffe heroes? We call them giraffe heroes because they're sticking their necks out, taking risks to do good things. Well, how do we get these stories out to the most eyeballs and the most ears? And so we're constantly looking at the best ways to do that. And so we began with vinyl disc, and also, I must say, paper press releases. We would crank out press releases about these stories and send them by postal mail or fax to as many people as we could get onto our mailing list. Um, and then we were among the first to start using social media among nonprofits, and we put these stories on our website, and then we began using the social media as social media was invented. First, it was way back when Facebook was one of the early ones, whatever. And now we use every source of we can. I mean, I personally have started, and your listeners can plug into this, a whole series of short videos on TikTok. I mean, could you imagine? I'm 82 years old, and I've started a series aimed at 22-year-olds, but I've got some 22-year-olds helping me do it. And the name of the series is Granddad, Badass Granddad.
Badass Granddad. I'm gonna have to
And
look that up.
it's 3-minute stories, and I start these stories the same way I start my speeches. I start by telling stories of my adventures. I mean, I've had so many adventures. I got 100 stories, 200 stories, each more riveting than the one before. And so I start telling these stories, and in 3 minutes, I spend maybe a minute and three quarters, maybe 2 minutes telling a story of some adventure that I walked away from, maybe a mountain climb, maybe it was something in a war or a revolution. And then I would draw from that story a life lesson of some kind about courage, about leadership, about service. And then I would end the broadcast with a call to action of some kind that wasn't smarmy. But I found that, first of all, to get a message across like that, you have to get people's attention. And I'm perfectly suited to do that because I have so many adventure stories. These are for 3-minute videos for young people, but I do the same thing to a ballroom with 5,000 people in it. If I'm given 45 minutes, I'll spend 40 minutes telling stories until people are on the edge of their seats saying, how the hell is that guy still alive? Jesus. Uh, then I'll say, look, let me tell you about the transition in my life, because I realized at a time in my life that physical adventure was no longer what I thought it was. And I changed my life, and I tell the story, kind of the story that I told earlier in this particular podcast, about how I changed my life and why I changed my life. And then I draw it into them saying, look, we're all the same. We're all looking for meaning. What is it that brings meaning in your life? I'm just challenging you. I tell these 5,000 people, I'm just challenging you to look at what brings meaning in your life. And I'm willing to bet that if not now, at some point in your life, you'll discover that it's some kind of service, some kind of giving back. I mean, maybe you're an outdoors person, so maybe your service is in some environmental thing, battling climate change, for example, or whatever. But you're going to find it, and you're going to find that it makes your life worth living more than money or power ever did. So, and then that's what I do with an audience of 5,000 people. Same thing I do
Right.
in 3 minutes with an audience of, oh, I don't know. I just started this Gradass Bad Dad. I've already got 60,000 views.
Wow.
And I put new ones up every week, a couple new ones up every week. My aim is to do at least 100 of them. After all, they're 3 minutes,
Hmm.
and I put them all out on TikTok. And they're great fun too. And I get, well, 50,000, 60,000 views in a short time is pretty darn good. So I know they're having an impact. And I urge your listeners to plug into Badass Granddad, all one word, I think, on
I'll put all the
TikTok.
details in the show notes. But John,
Yeah.
what is your favorite story to tell?
I have lots of favorite stories. One it just happened, and it's still sticking in my mind because it seems like such a classic giraffe hero story, is of a young woman in Uganda. in East Africa. And as you probably know, Uganda and in many other African countries, the role of the rights of women are severely limited. These are often outside of the capital cities anyway. These are traditional tribal societies which are totally male driven, and there's a whole lot of misogyny. Not only that, there's physical abuse of women, as some of you know, is terrible. And this woman is fighting all that. She spends her time, a lot of it, in tribal areas of Uganda, preaching to women in particular that they have rights and they should fight for their rights and not just agree to what the tribal chiefs and the tribal customs say that should be their role. And then she goes into Kampala, the capital, and she lobbies the government for changes in the constitution and changes of the law, giving women rights, political rights, economic rights, and stature. And so she's aiming to change the whole role of women in Uganda. That's one person. And it's damn dangerous because the tribal chiefs want to kill her. Literally, they want to kill her because she's a huge threat to their power base. So that's one of them. And then a totally different one is a guy in, I forget where he is, but he works for the Veterans Administration. And he uncovered, as part of his work in the Veterans Administration, he uncovered some part of the administration that was deep in a corrupt practice. There was some real bad stuff going on, money leaking out the wrong areas, not going to vets. And it was very sensitive inside the VA. So he complained to his bosses in the VA, and they basically told him to shut up. They would take care of it, but nothing happened. So then he became a whistleblower and he started going public with his stories about corruption in the VA. And people began to listen, and he got fired because people really didn't like what was going on in the VA, and his stories brought a lot of criticism down on the leaders of the Veterans Administration, but it also brought change. Congress heard of this and began to demand changes in the way the VA was operating. So this guy lost his job, lost his livelihood, but at the same time, a whole lot of vets got benefits that they had been denied because the money had been lost or misspent. So that's another completely different view of what a giraffe hero does.
Amazing.
And we've honored over 2,000, over 1,500 giraffe heroes. So, there's 1,498 more.
Right, right.
Oh, by the way, let me say, your viewers, listeners can get all 1,500 stories by going into our database. Our website is giraffe.org, and at the top in the nav bar there you can easily see access to our library of heroes. Or on the website itself, there are probably 50 or 60 of these stories and pictures. So that's how to get hold of these stories, giraffe.org.
Amazing. Yeah, we'll put that in the show notes. Another question, John, and I forgot to ask it as you're talking about it, but so a big component of my life was studying abroad in South Africa. I spent about 6 months there. One of the most amazing experiences. I was able to travel to parts of Eastern Africa like Tanzania, Kenya. But yeah, a big component when I was studying abroad there, you felt I guess the racial animosity. Even this is back in 2018. They even still considered in South Africa white people, colored people, and black people, and kind of had almost a caste
Yeah,
system
yeah.
like that. How was South Africa when you were? Because I'm assuming you lived there when you're trying to stop apartheid. How was it like back then?
I didn't live there. I was a diplomat at the United Nations, so I had considerable power to change things. And that's what I did through UN resolutions that made a difference. And the big difference between South Africa then and the South Africa that you lived in was that racism was institutionalized. It was the law of the land. Now, of course, there's racism in Southern Africa. It's like there's racism still in the United States, but there have been the transfer of power to black-led governments with Nelson Mandela and Mr. de Klerk changed everything institutionally. Now, South Africa is hardly a perfect society, in some cases because some of the governments, black-led governments, have been horrendously corrupt and inefficient, which is too bad. So South
Zoom mind.
Africa, or nominally a rich country, which you saw, still is a lot of poverty because the wealth doesn't all go to the people it should go to. And there's still remnants of white supremacy, there's no question about it. And you go to Zimbabwe, for example, where they came very close to a horrendous bloodbath because the percentage of whites in Rhodesia was smaller than the percentage of whites in South Africa. And they didn't see any way to keep their power but to start a white-led war
Hmm.
and put the blacks down. But that war didn't happen in large part because of what the United Nations did. Where when I was there, we set up a negotiating system where whites and blacks finally realized that a war would serve nobody, and the whites agreed to step down peaceably, just as they did in South Africa. And a black government was formed in Rhodesia, southern Rhodesia, which became Zimbabwe. Um, so things could have been so much worse, because I was there when all this was on a knife edge, and we were really looking at horrendous racial wars going on, and they didn't happen for the large part. Yeah, sure, there was violence, the Mau Maus in Kenya, for example, black-led revolts and revolutions and riots in South Africa and southern Rhodesia. It wasn't entirely peaceful, but it was way more peaceful. And I attribute that to largely the black leadership. People like Nelson Mandela, for example. You talked earlier about heroes of mine. Well, Teddy Roosevelt was one, but right up there at the top is Nelson Mandela. Boy, that guy had guts. And his heart was full of compassion. I mean, to spend 24 years in a white prison and then come back and forgive them at least enough to lead a multiracial government was extraordinary.
Yeah, it's one of the most compelling stories in modern history. Yeah, it's and spending 24 years on Robben Island and seeing kind of Cape Town develop and grow is, I mean, he probably learned a lot, a lot of mindfulness with his thoughts. But John, I really appreciate your time. I want to end this on a high note. Is there anything that you'd like to share to our listeners? Any word of motivation, any word of advice?
I'll just say what I've said 3 or 4 times already. Look in the mirror in the morning and figure out what's meaningful in your life, and at least entertain the thought. What might bring real meaning into your life is some kind of service. It could be something really simple, like volunteering with your local service club, or even taking a stronger role in dealing with your own grandchildren and children. Or it could be something much bigger than that. It could be something political. It could be something economic. But there's something. Take a look at your skills, your resources. What can you do? And I just guarantee you that when you go out there and do it, first of all, you'll solve a problem. But second of all, and just as important, is you'll reshape your own life. You'll reshape your own life. You'll find a life that maybe was hidden from you, as it was from me. You'll find a life that's way happier, that has way more personal benefits than whatever you're doing now. So think of that. Just think of that. And think of role models too. And if you want to, take a hint by going on the giraffe.org if you want to look at our role models. But look at role models in your own life. Look at people that you admire who have turned their lives towards some kind of service, some kind of making the town better, making the community better, making the country better. See what makes them tick. Talk to them, read about them, and see if you can find those same impulses in yourself.
Amazing, John. Really appreciate it. One more thing.
Mm.
What's for our listeners if they are interested in being a part of the Giraffe Project? What is the best way to contact you?
Well, that's easy. Just go on giraffe.org, and you can see if you want to help, there's a donate button. We're a nonprofit, always looking for money. But mostly look on giraffe.org and see what we're doing and be inspired by what we're doing. And in terms of myself personally, I'm at johngraham.org. My name, John Graham, all one word.org. And you'll learn more about what I'm doing, what I've done, my horrendous biography, all the crazy stuff that I've done. It's pretty interesting, I think. But there's a lot of information too on my speeches and podcasts, how to get a hold of me, how to book me, that sort of thing. And then finally, I've written a lot of books, and the last one is Quest, Risk, Adventure, and the Search for Meaning. You can order it from your bookstore or get it on Amazon.
Sounds great. We'll put all the information in the show notes. John, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for being a fantastic guest on the Gildre Spotlight podcast.
Hey, I'm really happy to be here. You're a great interviewer, and I love being here, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you so much.